Yes. So yeah, in terms of Historic Environment Scotland and the archive here, I'll set the scene a little bit, both about the wider organisation. So you can see there, we're a charity dedicated to the advancement of heritage, culture, education, and environmental protection. Many of you might know the organisation and its work by what we refer to as its sub-brands. So many of you might recognise the name Historic Scotland, perhaps more readily than you might recognise Historic Environment Scotland. And Historic Scotland is a part of the organisation that looks after what we call properties in care, so the likes of Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, Urquhart Castle. Here, the building you've come to today is a home for our archive. I'll talk about some of the other names and acronyms as we go. A big part of the digital output and most of the images that I show today on screen, you can go home tonight and find yourself on trove.scot. And trove.scot is essentially the online window for all of the stuff that we look after. It's a great place to start your research. So I'm not showing you anything, bar a few of my own photos. I'm not showing you anything that you can't access yourself for your own research and enjoyment. So this is the building you're in at the moment. For those of you who maybe been in Edinburgh a wee bit longer, you might remember this building as the furniture store, kind of warehouse for C&J Brown's, which was a department store where Sainsbury's is now on the corner. They were just next door. Here, yeah, yes, and that building's gone now. That's the student flats just to the left of the front door. So the archive that we look after relates to Scotland's archaeology, architecture, industrial and maritime heritage. So quite often we refer to keeping the national record on Scotland's architecture, archaeology. So a lot of what we look after relates to places, sites, monuments, locations. But we also look after some digital collections of material contributed from museums and galleries, archives throughout Scotland, and they provide some more of the people-focused records that I will share with you today as well. So the two sets of content, both the original archive material that's been digitised and some of the digital records that we have in our care, combined to tell some quite rich stories. The archive here, we hold a lot of paper material, lots of accessioned drawings, plans, manuscripts relating to buildings and sites, monuments throughout Scotland. We also offer a range of engagement events throughout the year. So I'll publicise the next talk, which my colleague Michael is giving. I'll mention that as we go through. There's also a small exhibition which relates to Michael's talk as well, which we'll hopefully have time to show you at the end. Now, coming to the archive here is fantastic and we're delighted to welcome you along, but we're also very aware that to share to wider and wider audiences, digitisation is a very important part of our work. So we're constantly trying to digitise more and more material and make it available online through trove.scot. And as well as holding lots of archive-related information, trove.scot also holds fantastic records relating to collection material. And what we mean by that is material that lives. So it might be paintings, it might be cannons, it might be a whole range of material that can be visited in our properties in care. And we also hold available through Trove and also through the Historic Environment Scotland portal. We hold information relating to designations and listings of buildings throughout Scotland. I promise I'll get away from acronyms, explanations of who we are and what we do shortly. But you might be saying, well, what does all this allow us to do? What does it allow us to tell? And I feel strongly it allows us to tell really rich stories about Scotland's places, people, events, and we're going to focus obviously today on some great Commonwealth games and football related records. But to give you an idea of how the material can be used to tell stories, this is another example, and probably before the 1970 Commonwealth Games, this would have been one of the largest, or even remains the largest public event ever held in Scotland. Can you anyone recognise what this is? Yeah, so it's a 1938 Empire exhibition held in Bellahouston Park, as you rightly point out. As well as ground survey material and accessioned collections of material, so people giving us donations of material. We also have some really fantastic collections of aerial photography, both from the past. This is a view of the exhibition in full swing in 1938, but we also have modern aerial survey material that we take ourselves as part of our job. This is the 38 exhibition, and this is the Clachan, which was a recreation of a Highland village for visitors to explore. This is Tate's Tower, as you mentioned there, and its elevator was reckoned to be the fastest in the world at the time and could take you to the viewing balconies from the ground floor in 26 seconds. This aerial photograph, I think, is another great one, and it almost has the modern exhibition area, which was very much largely temporary. I think there's maybe one or two buildings that remain, but most of that was gone in very quick order after the exhibition closed, and it has a kind of white outline there around the maybe greyer buildings roundabouts. These aerial images that we hold often capture an event or a specific, maybe taken to capture a specific location. But as you can imagine, they show the wider Glasgow area, in this case, developing housing estates and an ever-growing city. That might have helped with the colouring of the building, yeah. This is one of my colleagues going out and taking survey aerial photography here. And as well as that ongoing work, we also have collections of aerial archive material that we look after. And I'll mention this briefly before I go to the Commonwealth Games. This is the Aerofilms collection, and these gentlemen returned from World War I with aerial reconnaissance skills, and they put them to use in a commercial business, capturing Britain from the air and selling their work. So this is Leith, pictured in 1932. A very different harbour. This is St Paul's Cathedral in 21, and the Three Graces in Liverpool. So although very much the majority of our focus is very much on Scottish records, we do also hold and look after some material from other parts of the UK. This is for those with a sweet tooth, this is the Cadbury works in Bourneville near Birmingham. And because we're going to be talking about sport, I had to get a sport one in. And this is Cardiff Arms Park, which is now a huge venue. I think it holds 70, 80,000. And this is it pictured in 1933. This is in Cardiff. So to the Commonwealth Games, and this the story, I suppose, starts in 1966 for the 1970 Games. And everyone hear me okay? Yeah, thanks. And I suppose, like all of these stories, it starts with a committee and a selection process and a room, I want to say, full of gentlemen. I think there's exclusively gentlemen in this room. And this was the Games organising committee. They met, this is them pictured in 68 in Edinburgh, but the decision was made in 66 in Jamaica. And it was between two venues. It was between Edinburgh and Christchurch, and Edinburgh won out. So the 1970 Games were coming to the city, and the Games themselves were seen by kind of aficionados as very much a Games of change. They were seen as the first Games to feature the word Commonwealth. Up until then, it had been exclusively the Empire Games. So there was perhaps a softening a recognition that the word empire was running it out of gas, if you like, and that there was a rebranding of Britain's interests abroad. It was also the first games to feature metric measurements and also the first to feature photo finish technology. So the city had won the prize and there was a great deal of excitement, but the facilities were not up to scratch. So the city started negotiations, looked at its holdings and worked out what it was going to do. It already had an athletics venue at what we refer to as the Meadowbank area. And that was kind of split between two sites referred to as Old Meadowbank and New Meadowbank at that time. This aerial view is from 1949. And for those of you who can't quite get your bearings, we're looking London Road here on the left of the image, and we're looking up towards the city centre. You can recognise quite clearly the colony buildings just at Abbey Hill, the very kind of rigid parallel lines of buildings. And you can also see some Maltings works on the right-hand side. So as ever, these photographs are fantastic records of a place and time. And if you use them to compare change over time, they can be very, very helpful. So the venues I talked about there are perhaps more clearly evident here. London Road, we've moved. London Road's on the right-hand side of the picture there, and you can see Old Meadowbank, which is the kind of smaller looking venue further north in the photograph with its grandstand, and that's beside Meadowbank, the predominantly more athletics focused part of the facility. So this is pictured before the work started. The old Meadowbank site was used as a World War II storage area for vehicles and became quite damaged. So the current occupants at the time were Leith Athletic football team, and they moved temporarily to the athletics stadium for a couple of years, I believe. So this particular site was seen as the way forward, and it was going to use the two footprints you can see there and turn them into one venue. Old Meadowbank, up until its closure, was probably most associated. Leith Athletic moved out, and for the remaining years of its life until its closure, it was most associated with Speedway and attracted some very large crowds. Speedway's still they're still an Edinburgh team, but I think they play perhaps or ride in West Lothian now. And this is the grandstand that you saw there, full of fans. Demolition of the two sites and the reconstruction of the site, turning it into one facility, was well underway here in 1968. And you can see the grandstand here being stripped of all its metals and what have you. We can see the brave new world starting to emerge here. You can see the large grandstand taking shape towards the middle of the photograph there. And again, these images capture maybe a changing Meadowbank area. And this is before the construction of Meadowbank House further towards Jock's Lodge. It wasn't just the infrastructure of the buildings, there was the installation of what became known as the tartan track. Some of you might remember what an innovation this was. Up until that time, a lot of athletics facilities in towns, countries, cities even would have been grass or ash tracks. But the tartan track was a kind of plastic formula and was designed to create faster times and be better for the athletes. Again, here we can see the emerging grandstands with the roof starting to take shape, and London Road is our constant on the right-hand side, We can also see towards the top of the picture the other main part of the Meadowbank site coming into use. And this is further east from the old Meadowbank Stadium, and this is the velodrome, the outside velodrome. It's more visible here on this, this shot taken from the other side. And this is right towards the completion, shortly before the completion of the Meadowbank works. All of this material, as I mentioned here, is searchable on trove.scot. And these records of the completed stadium, this is a good few years into its life, starting to show a bit of wear and tear. But on its completion, it was probably, I reckon, the largest grandstand in the city at the time, maybe larger than Hearts and Hibs, perhaps not as large as Meadowbank, maybe, but it had a capacity of 5,000. So it was a large stand, the wider ground, 5,000. These are some survey photographs from Meadowbank before it closed later in its life. And this is the velodrome, which looks terrifying to me there. I think the idea of an outdoor velodrome in the wet doesn't fill me with confidence. You can also see Meadowbank House in the background there as well. For those of you who remember the site, this was the rather scary entrance to the velodrome. So this would get you into the middle and then you would join the track. So we're getting closer to the 1970 games starting. And I mentioned about the innovation. And one of the things that was put in place for the 70 games, perhaps with less individual car ownership, was a temporary railway station was created and operated from just off London Road. And this bridge was constructed to take pedestrians across from the station to the stadium. For those of you who like cars from that time, we have a wealth of images like this where you can explore some cracking models from the past. So that's Meadowbank. The other main site is just 2 minutes walk from where we are at the moment, maybe a wee bit longer, and that was the Commonwealth pool under construction. So this is the area photographed in 1951, and you can see here the kind of broad footprint. You can see the bowling green, which is still in place there, the kind of square selection of grass there, and you can see what went on to become Scottish Widows buildings just to the left-hand side of the photograph there as well. No Pollock Hall's student accommodation at this time, that's yet to come. But in this next photograph, prior to work taking place, Pollock Halls has come into being for its student accommodation, and that also acted as the game's competitors' village. It had been built, I think, a few years before in the 1960s. So this is the site under development. And to give you an idea of the change over time, this is an aerial view with the Scottish Widows building, which was designed by Basil Spence, whose archive we hold here in the archive. And you can see the completed Commonwealth pool on the right-hand side of the image. But it didn't just spring up overnight. The pool was a colossal construction project, and you'll find some records on display here, some of the plans, really interesting drawings. And it was also very much seen as a kind of new vision for a leisure facility. Victorian pools that we were maybe used to up until then were very much associated with the idea, I grew up referring to the swimming pool as the baths. And it was very much associated perhaps with cleanliness, hygiene, that kind of idea. Hello. That idea was maybe changing over time, and the idea of more leisure pursuits was coming into being. But slowly the building took shape, and that's a again, I find aerial photography fascinating because I pass the pool every day, but I never really think of that top-down view of what the pool looks like, and it's quite something to see. So that was it completed, or more or less completed. And on Trove.Scot, we hold some really great records. All of the material I'm showing you today, so you can find lots of photography, you can find lots of information on original archive material that you can visit. But we also, through our designations and listing information, fantastic resources with really detailed information about why a building is perhaps viewed as having special um, interest to organisations like us and to the wider public. And this particular description of the Commonwealth Pools listing I found fascinating. It describes the construction as a milestone in the development of the modern leisure centre, representing a shift in thinking away from the municipal baths of the late 19th century and early 20th century, with their emphasis on hygiene and physical fitness, to the modern ethos of community, recreation, and sport. So the swimming pool was underway, Meadowbank was underway, but there was a whole team of people that were needed to support the athletes. And this is some of the catering staff. So the reason we have an archive like this, or digital collection of material in our possession, if you like, is this is part of the contributed records from museums, galleries, archives that came to us as part of the Scran collection. Scran no longer exists as a separate site, but most of the material you can now find on Trove.Scot. So these are some of the staff from Pollock Halls who had the very difficult job of feeding thousands of athletes. There's a lot of modern discussion about team outfits, and in 1970 it was no different. And this is the Scottish women's swimming team with their brand new outfits, and you can get a sense of the levels of excitement, I think. I watched the opening ceremony for the current games last week, and there was lots of very cool outfits. And it's now, I think it's almost given that Scots men wear kilts at these things, but that wasn't the case in the past. And this gentleman sporting the Scottish outfit here with the kind of more formal jacket and trousers. So the games got underway, and this is the opening ceremony from 1970 with a lot of pomp and ceremony, and some of the competing teams in action here, going round the track, the new tartan track. In terms of some of the stars of the games, in the pool, there was a very young David Wilkie ahead of his yet to come world record breaking times. So he competed at the 70 Games. Another from a Scottish point of view, this was perhaps one of the great success stories. The athlete to the furthest right is probably one of the greatest long distance runners ever, Kip Keino from Kenya. But he was beaten in the 5,000 metres by not one, but two Scots, Ian McCafferty and Ian Stewart, who won gold. Meadowbank and uh, the Commonwealth Pool weren't the only venues for the games. There was quite a selection of other places that hosted games, sports. And this is Ball Green Bowling Complex, which held lots and lots of bowling matches. This is part of the round robin competition, and this features some of you might recognise the gentleman on the left, David Bryant. He had a long career in bowls, and he was always famous for smoking his pipe. I remember him as a wee boy. He was a kind of number one in the world. And for those of you who like tobacco in sport, you might get the detail of Bob Matroni, who is a Scottish bowler to the right-hand side, and he's got a fag in his mouth in perhaps the biggest tournament he was ever involved with, but it didn't stop him. Didn't stop him smoking. Cycling, the long distance cycling, as well as the shorter distances at the velodrome, the longer distance cycling took place in Holyrood Park, and it was a 102-mile race, rounds and rounds. I think it was 30-something rotations of Holyrood Park, which is another HES looked after site. And so if you can imagine going 30-something times round, 102 miles, that was the finish between the two cyclists. The chap on the right-hand side is Bruce Biddle from New Zealand, and he won a fraction of a second ahead of his Australian opponent, Ray Bilney. This is a picture of Leith Town Hall, and Leith Town Hall was home to the weightlifting, which was a big event and very much suited to that kind of theatre, looking on to the stage and the lifters. And one of the big stars of the games, full stop, was this gentleman here. Anyone recognise him or remember him? Precious Mackenzie, well done. Precious Mackenzie's got a fascinating story. I vaguely remember him competing at later games. I don't remember him from 70, but he was 4'9". He was very, very small in stature, but he was phenomenally strong. And his story, his wider story, is fascinating. He was born and brought up in South Africa, and he was at this stage, I think he's maybe 33, 34, so he was quite an experienced athlete by this stage. But he was prevented from competing at the 58 Empire Games because of apartheid in South Africa. He wasn't allowed to join the South African team. He was offered a place at the 64 Olympics. I think the South African athletics body had seen the talent they had at their disposal. But if he went to the games, he was to be segregated from white athletes. And I think he kind of said, well, I don't want to be here anymore. So he emigrated to the UK and went on to represent England. So at the 1970 games, he represented England and won the gold medal. He, from there, was also successful in 74 in Christchurch in New Zealand, and decided to relocate to New Zealand, and in a subsequent games represented New Zealand. He changed countries. He's still alive. He's 90, and if you ever look for him online, you'll normally see a picture of him with Muhammad Ali on his shoulders. But he was phenomenally, I think the height helped with that kind of snatch type of lifting, very low center of gravity. But he was undoubtedly one of the stars of the games. So we'll leave one of the names very much associated with 1970, and we'll move to one of the names who was very much associated with the games the next time they came to Edinburgh, and that was Robert Maxwell. And this follows on also from the theme of Precious Mackenzie's experience with apartheid. And the 86 games perhaps kind of mirror, for very different reasons, but they maybe mirror the kind of change of perception perhaps of the current games in Glasgow, or certainly the run-up to the current games in Glasgow, where maybe the appetite wasn't so great as for the 2014 games. The 86 games, for those of you who remember, were clouded in controversy. 32 of the 59 Commonwealth game countries chose not to compete because of Britain's, the UK government's stance on sporting ties with South Africa, i.e. they kept those ties rather than severing them. So the games themselves were up against it. The lack of competing countries impacted how attractive it was for revenue generation via broadcasting. So there was the Games Committee was up against it. And Robert Maxwell, who was seen as a kind of, in some quarters, seen perhaps as a saviour of the games by offering to come up with cash to keep it going. Other people perhaps see his final contribution as considerably lower than was advertised at the time. But here he is in action, and here he is with Margaret Thatcher. He certainly had great prominence at the Games, and he was even, I think he was given the kind of chair role. Here he is addressing the crowds at the opening ceremony. This view of the opening ceremony of the 86 Games also shows perhaps some subtle changes. I think the scoreboard was new for the 86 Games. I might be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure it was. And you can also see commercial advertising, which was perhaps not so prevalent at the 70 Games. For those of you who watched the opening ceremony the other night, Nessie was also taking part last Thursday night, and here Nessie was part of the 86 Games as well. And again, a real kind of focus on making the most of what they could with limited participants. But still, the Games were underway, and there was thousands of competing athletes, just not as many as there would be in previous or subsequent Games. Other venues that were introduced, this is one of our survey images of Barry Links near Dundee, and this is the venue for the shooting at the 86 Commonwealth Games. This was a new venue, and this picture here is of the Scottish Coxed Fours. Rowing came into the Games, and this was held at Strathclyde Country Park near Hamilton. In terms of stars of the Games, from a domestic sense, Liz Lynch, as she was here, was probably the biggest athletics success story. She won gold in the 10,000 metres, and her daughter went on to compete in subsequent Games. I think she's pulled out of the current Games with injury. And if there was participants who went on to perhaps greater things initially and then to infamy, some of you may remember this chap. This is Ben Johnson, the Canadian sprinter, who won 2 golds in Edinburgh, but subsequently went on to test positive for steroids and was perhaps more infamous for that. Leaving Edinburgh and moving forward to the 2014 Games, and perhaps like the kind of excitement around the 70 Games, I kind of get the same perhaps feeling around the 14 Games. There was very much a desire to regenerate in Glasgow, to perhaps use existing facilities, and I think Glasgow did that personally. I think it did that very well. Newly created facilities that maybe matched the excitement of the Commonwealth pool, and refurbished Meadowbank for the 70 Games in Edinburgh. The 14 Games were to become the largest sports event ever held in Scotland, with 5,000 athletes taking place, considerably greater than both the 70 and 86 Games. And with the building of the facilities in Glasgow, there was very much a sense, perhaps greater political scrutiny, maybe not, around the desire for facilities that would last the test of time. And that wasn't just the sports facilities such as the indoor sports arena and velodrome named after Chris Hoy. It was also the sense that people wanted to get from the accommodation that needed to be built for this record number of athletes. And in terms of the site itself, we can again use aerial photography from the time. This is from 2010. So for those of you who are not familiar with the area in Glasgow that much of the Games was based around, that's Celtic Park at the top left-hand side of the picture. And you can see the velodrome and what went on to become known as the Emirates Arena kind of just below that. The area to the right-hand side towards the river was the area put aside for construction of the Games Village. And again, that sense, there was a real desire that was to not just be built as a temporary solution, it was to become a mixture of affordable housing for use in the future. One of the great, when I was researching the talk today, I came across some fantastic records. This is images contributed by AOC Archaeology, and they did a fantastic. They were contracted ahead as part of the renovation works, the digging ahead of the construction of the new buildings. They created some amazing archives of what they came across as part of that dig and giving a nod towards Glasgow's kind of industrial past, some of the buildings, some of the factory remains that they came across. As things developed in the games, this is 2011, excuse me, and we can see Celtic Park this time at the bottom of the photograph, and we can see a more or less completed velodrome and Emirates Stadium. You can start to see work taking place on shaping the ground for the athletes' village. And then as we move through time here, a bit of a cloud over this image, but where the cloud is, you can see a lot of that newly created housing, which came into use immediately after the games. And this is a better shot here with the velodrome and Emirates Arena on the far right-hand side of the picture. I would normally like to come out and point all over this, but I've got to keep my face in the shot for the recording. Sorry saying that, Joe. Shouldn't have said that. I'm going to transition now to the kind of next part of the talk, which is focusing on tying in with the World Cup this year and some of football's venues and connections here in Scotland. And I mentioned in the talk description world record crowds, and I was kind of roughly aware of that, but I never really put too much thought into it. So while researching the talk and exploring some of the stadiums, I was really quite astounded at the level of attendance in Scotland, particularly in Glasgow's three biggest stadiums. As we transition from the games, Celtic Park was used as the venue for the opening ceremony of the games in 2014. And Hampden, which we'll come to towards the end of the talk, was the home for the athletics. But this is Celtic Park pictured, and Celtic Park's now got the largest capacity of any stadium in any football stadium in Scotland. It holds approximately 60,000 people, but it wasn't always like that. And this is a stadium under some remedial works ahead of the games starting. The kind of modern Celtic Park that we know today was redeveloped quite considerably following a fire in the 1928-29 season. And again, some of these stats that come up, I think, are quite interesting. The rebuilt Celtic Park with very little capacity for seats, very much focused on standing. And that's what contributed to some of these massive attendances. It's the standing areas. Celtic Park was reckoned to be bigger. The redeveloped Celtic Park was reckoned to be bigger than any stadium in England, but yet at the time was still just the third biggest in Glasgow. So it gives you that sense of what an appetite there was for the game in Glasgow in particular, also in other parts of Scotland. Various developments of Celtic Park took part over time, but particularly around periods of success, and the same could be said for Rangers at this time. Often the redevelopment came following successful periods. So the modern Celtic Park, as we know it today, only really came into being following the Taylor Report. The Taylor Report, for those of you who are not familiar with it, was a government report following several disasters in the 80s, following in the heels, particularly of Hillsborough. And it saw a massive change in safety restrictions and protocols around football stadiums in the country. Celtic's largest ever home attendance came a few years after this particular photograph. This is a game against Partick Thistle, I think, from 1959. And yeah, sorry, a few years before was the largest ever attendance. And that was 83,500 for a visit of Rangers at Celtic Park. This is a picture from the early 90s. The main stand here had been redeveloped considerably, but the rest of the ground wasn't too different from the 1950s photograph that we saw earlier. This aerial photograph gives you a sense of Celtic Park's place in the local community before redevelopment and also the subsequent redevelopment required for the 2014 games. So the modern all-seater stadium looks like this, 60,000 capacity. At Rangers, it was a kind of similar story with the stadium taking place over time and particular moments in time affecting the development and changing in attitudes. We're talking about athletics with the Commonwealth Games, and this is not the Commonwealth Games. This is Rangers' annual sports day, which was held every year. I'm not sure if any of these are players. I can't imagine players being allowed to vault like that now. Insurance wouldn't be very happy with that. But this is the 49th annual sports day at Rangers in 1935. For those of you familiar or have got an interest in football stadium design, Ibrox was designed by the architect Archibald Leach, and we have a book out on display which highlights his work. He was this crisscross kind of metal work on the stand was his kind of signature piece, and that was you could see that in several grounds throughout the UK, including Portsmouth, I think Goodison and Liverpool as well. Aerial photography again gives us the sense of these massive bowls of stadiums. This is 1927 Ibrox, and you can get a sense perhaps how these crowds were able to fit. I'm still not sure I totally see how they fitted without a lot of discomfort, but again, it gives you that idea of the excitement and the desire to see these games. So this is Ibrox pictured in 1927, shortly before the development of the main stand, which you can see on this later photograph is 1959, and the red brickwork main stand, which is very much associated with how we view the ground today, is visible on the left-hand side. Also in this picture, you can see another stadium behind Ibrox. I think this was known as the Albion, this particular ground here. And in the next photo, I'll show you, this focuses, this is another aerial, this is from the Aero Films collection. And this actually shows three stadiums. Ibrox can be seen, I'll just leave my photograph. That's Ibrox there with its protected, now scheduled main stands. That's the Albion, and that's White City. So three large stadiums, very close to each other. White City, I think, was most connected with dog racing. And that's the modern Ibrox that we kind of recognise today. The modern Ibrox was very much a focus and became a realization following the Ibrox disaster of 1971, when several 66, I think 66 people were killed, and the club decided to create an all-seater stadium in memory of those who'd lost their life. And that was a theme we would see in the redevelopment of many stadiums over the next 10 to 20 years. I threw these couple of images in for a bit of fun. It wasn't always football at our venues, so I've got a couple of other examples from Ibrox here. A lot more women than would normally be at Rangers at this time. Anyone guess what they're there for or who they're there for? Yeah. Billy Graham, well done. A very learned audience. So this is 1957, and it's also a record of the crowds that Billy Graham attracted on his travels. Another American performer here, Frank Sinatra at Ibrox in 1990. So I'm going to get towards the end, folks. I promise you've stuck with me very well. I'm going to move to Hampden, and that's the site of the real huge record-breaking crowds that I've mentioned before, and world record attendances, or certainly at the time, world records attendances. My colleague Kyle Armstrong and several colleagues throughout the organisation have put together some fantastic resources about the development of several different Hampdens over the years. The first Hampden was in the news not long ago, and part of that very much to do with the scheduling of the original Hampden Park, which went on to become a bowling club, and was seen by many at the time as being the first modern football stadium of its time. So it was quite groundbreaking with a pavilion, and there's some really great resources that you can view. That's on the Historic Environment Scott website. You can find a great piece there by Kyle. I'm going to mention Hampden mostly in its current location, but there was also a second Hampden, which again is now listed as a scheduled monument. That second Hampden was also known more commonly as Cathkin Park, and was the home of 3rd Lanark, who were a very successful senior side at the time. This is what Cathkin Park looks like today, and you can still wander along the terraces. For those of you who are interested in their story and their subsequent demise, it's quite a blockbuster of a tale if you've got time to have a look. But this is the Hampden Stadium that I'll focus on for the next few slides. And this is it pictured in 1927. And from its opening in 1903, this ground, which was not only home to the Scottish national team, but was also home to Queen's Park, was reckoned to be the football stadium with the biggest capacity in the world. It was surpassed by the Maracanã in Brazil when it was finished in 1950. The record home, Queen's Park's record home attendance was 95,000, and that was in 1930 when they hosted Rangers. But the 1937 Scotland-England game had an attendance at the stadium very much looking like this of 149,415. And then shortly afterwards, the highest ever Scottish domestic game attendance for Aberdeen and Celtic in the Scottish Cup final, 147,365 people attended Hampden for this match, and that stood as a world record club attendance for more than 25 years. I'm seeing all these big numbers. What was it like to be there? How packed in were people? We can't travel back in time. If any of you were there for these games, you're all too young. I can only imagine how cramped, and there are stories, legends, some of them more tasteful than others, about how tight and how cramped you were and what ability you had to go anywhere. I think this particular image was one that I could find. This is from 1959, and this is an Old Firm game. And it gives you that sense of these are sardines, and it gives you perhaps a sense of why this needed to change as well, because it wasn't perhaps as safe an environment as it could be. Compared to the previous image, you'll notice a change here. There's in the north terracing here, there's now a kind of upper stand which has been built, but largely unchanged. And it was largely unchanged for the next few decades. The only kind of noticeable one was the addition of a roof over what commonly gets referred to as the Rangers End on the west of the stadium. This next image, again, I think you get a sense of the crowd. This attendance is 1966. So this is just before England were crowned world champions and they defeated Scotland 4-3 at Hampden. And this was only 130,000 at this game. So it's Not by no means the biggest, but again, you can see that packed nature of it all. Bobby Charlton, the England player, is on record. I've seen him interviewed, and it was quite an intimidating atmosphere, considerably larger capacity than Wembley of the time. And there was some of the English players could take a while to find their feet. Plus, they were probably being given all kinds of helpful advice by the Scottish crowd as well. But Bobby Charlton had a quote at the time for his colleague, and he said, if you get a chance, have a look at the crowd. He said, you won't see their arms. He said, all they do is bawl because they've got no space to lift their arms. And again, that gives us an indication of a changing direction for sporting venues and ultimately the safety of crowds like this. I'm going to finish up shortly, folks. And when it came to Hampden, I thought it's hard to maybe pick one particular player or team. So I've gone with an event, and this is a precursor to the event. Anyone recognise what this queue outside Hampden is for? Tickets, you're right. Any particular game? It's kind of thought of as the best game ever played here. It's 1960 and it's Real Madrid versus Eintracht Frankfurt. So no Scotsman in sight. Maybe there's some connection there that thought of as the best game ever, and it doesn't feature Scotland. So that might say something. But it's a 1960 European final, and it was between Real Madrid and Eintracht Frankfurt. And it's reckoned as being one of the greatest games ever played. It finished 7-3 to Real Madrid. And that was a Real Madrid team that featured Ferenc Puskas and Alfredo Di Stefano, and they both scored hat-tricks in the game. And again, you can get a sense of the crowd here. Now, while some Germans and Spaniards did travel for the game, the crowd, the record crowd for a European final at the time, I think, was largely a domestic crowd. This is, 127,000 people at this game. This is the Real Madrid team being awarded the trophy. So as I've said, they are given several indications. Hampden needed to change, and it did change around the turn of the century with some Millennium Commission funding and various other pieces of work, and it changed into a modern stadium. The national team played elsewhere while the work took place. And you can see here the final stages of the new roofed Hampden taking shape. And this is around 2001. So this is the interior of the modern stadium. This is what it looks like today. That's the main stand pictured from the north stand. And that's the east terracing and the west terracing from the north. Anyone know the current capacity of Hampden? Well done, 52,000. You're good. I'll swap places. I'll get you up here. 52,000. So I tell my son when we go, I say, can you imagine 3 times the number? Because the capacities I've mentioned here were the official capacities, and there are stories of yore that suggest that there may have been even 10, 15, 20,000 more in some of those earlier games. So it's obviously a more modern stadium with an appropriate capacity, 52,000. I promise I'll shut up soon, folks. This, for those of you concerned that you've not seen any Edinburgh football stadia, we could very much tell a similar story for both Hibs and Hearts. This is Easter Road, pictured in the 50s, and opposite the main stand, this huge bank of terracing held enormous crowds. Hibs' greatest attendance coming in a game against a New Year game against Hearts, were 65,000 crammed into Easter Road, and that's more than three times the current capacity. Tynecastle was no different. This is Tynecastle pictured in the 50s, their greatest crowd coming pre-war, over 50,000 attending a game against Rangers. So we've seen the end of the 100,000 plus attendances, and we've seen the end of another disappointing World Cup campaign for Scotland. However, when it comes to attendances, certainly the top level in Scotland, we continue to lead the way in terms of appetite for football. So maybe we don't learn our lessons. An annual UEFA report highlights that football fans across Scotland have recorded significantly higher top flight attendances per capita than any other league in Europe. So the top league in Scotland boasts 18.5 attendees per thousand, and that's 70% higher than the next league on the continent. So although we're not the biggest by number, we're the biggest pro rata. Anyone guess the second? No prizes, just pressure on yourself to get another one right. No, it's Portugal's the second one, and I think the third one's the Netherlands. So I think overall, perhaps England is the highest, but pro rata, it's ourselves. So, thank you very much for sticking with me, folks. Those are my contact details. Very good to hear from you. I won't be rushing off. Fantastic records to look at. Those are my contact details. Before I go, I said I would give a plug for our next talk. It's being delivered by my colleague Michael, who I'm just going to drop in it. That's Michael at the back there. And he's going to be delivering a talk on housing people in Scotland, a fantastic look at the development of tenement housing through the years. And that will be on Monday, the 28th of September. It will be here in the archive. And if you're interested in attending, spaces are going, but I think there's some spaces left. Just drop us an email the same way you booked for today. So thanks very much, folks, for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.